The weekend saw an unexpected and massive attack by Hamas militants into Israel, one that hasn't been seen in at least 50 years, with at least 3,000 missiles raining into Israel. There were incursions by land and by sea as well. A counterattack has begun, and it's looking like a full-blown war in a very, very tumultuous region once again. Now, the question is, what's going to be the impact on crude? We've already seen an initial spurt of crude prices fall to 5% in Monday morning trade, but can this sustain? Is this a long-term worry? Where are we going to go from here? To speak on all of this and more, I'm joined now by Vandana Hari. Vandana, great to speak with you on BQ Prime. She's one of the foremost voices on this space, and we're hoping to get a perspective of how worrisome these developments are. Vandana, let me begin with your opening comments on what we've seen over the weekend and what the worry is that we're seeing now. When we're seeing crude prices jump up, is this a sentimental reaction more than anything else?
Good morning, Tamanna, and glad to be back on your channel again. So indeed, what we saw this morning in Asia when markets opened was a knee-jerk reaction, which is quite typical in the market in the event of any sort of disturbance or a flare-up in the Middle East, which is at the outset is pricing in the worst case scenario. So this is a conflict, as you were just mentioning, a war between Israel and the Hamas militants in Palestine, which does not directly and has not impacted any oil or gas supply from the region. But the danger here is, well, first of all, it sits on the doorstep of a major oil and gas producing region, of course. And the other major danger is that this is never just a bilateral conflict. There are vested interests on both supporting both the sides. So the danger here is, what if this escalates into a wider regional conflict, which then obviously does carry a risk to oil and gas supply. You know, every third barrel of oil that the world uses comes from the Middle East. And we have seen over the past several years, even decades, that every time tensions in the region rise, especially between Iran and its Arab neighbors, oil does get affected. We've had massive outages in Saudi Arabia in 2019 when the Houthi militants, who are also said to be backed by Iran, from Yemen, had attacked Saudi facilities. And then you have the choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. So this is what the market is factoring in at the outset. But again, as you just mentioned, after the first knee-jerk reaction, it seems crude has pulled back a bit. I think if the situation remains limited to the Israel and Palestine area, then we will probably not see any impact on oil, and prices should continue to cool back a little bit.
If we are seeing a limited sort of range of this war, of this conflict, Vandana, what are the kind of levels we're looking at? Because this, obviously, we have to contextualize. It comes after a week of a lot of volatility as well. There were concerns about stocks running out, and then prices went up, and they cooled off quite dramatically. So what are the kind of levels you're looking at if this remains a relatively more localized zone of conflict?
Yeah, so right now what has happened is that this conflict has pretty much elbowed everything else out of the stage. You know, this is where the oil market is focused. But what you will see as and when this sort of the dust settles down on this, and it may not be very soon. It does look like this could rage on for a few more days, and in which case the market will remain a bit on tenterhooks. But as and when it calms down, we go back to the basics and the fundamentals. So when you're looking at fundamentals, of course, we saw a run up in prices about 10 sessions ago. Brent was $97. And then we saw a massive slump last week, which was basically on renewed fears of what the spiking bond yields, higher for longer interest rates by Fed might do to the US economy. So in the background, or shall we say in the wings, these factors remain in place. One of them, obviously on the supply side, is deep OPEC plus cuts, nearly 3 million barrels per day, the deepest they have cut since the 2020 COVID crisis on the supply side. And on the demand side, not very tangible evidence of demand destruction, but fears that demand may come down because of high prices, and a proxy for demand, which is the economic sentiment globally. So we will see those factors gradually coming back into the driver's seat. But for the next few days, perhaps, I think the focus will remain on the fears of the Middle East getting sucked into this.
What are you reading from the official statements and responses that have come in from major oil-producing nations so far to this conflict? We saw Saudi Arabia, for example, of course, condemning the violence, but also contextualizing it, saying that this has happened because of the occupation of Palestine. And a similar tone and tenor from major oil-producing nations. How do you see that panning out? Do you see that impacting any kind of oil production decisions in the future? Because we know this has happened in the past.
Yeah, great question, Tamanna. So the politics behind these long-running tensions I've mentioned over decades, right, in the Middle East, the politics go very, very deep. The politics are also not static. You know, it's been quite a situation of flux, but it's quite a dynamic change. And you know, in recent days and weeks, you'll recall there has been a lot of talk of Saudi Arabia, for instance, normalizing relations with Israel. You know, at the behest of the US, which has been a major sort of broker between this. Saudi-Iran relations have also been, there have been attempts to normalize them a bit. Iran-US relations also have gone through a lot of ups and downs. And so we have to keep this in mind that none of this is static. But what does remain at the backdrop of all of this is that, yes, there are tensions, very long-running political and religious even rivalries in the region, right? But as far as OPEC Plus is concerned, we saw a statement come out of Riyadh on Sunday where a few regional oil ministers were meeting, and they said that no change as of now in their production targets, but they made a sort of a generic sort of statement that we stand ready to act if needed to stabilize the market. So OPEC's rhetoric has remained the same, that they do feel the need to continue cutting back output because they think demand may not pan out as expected. But as of now, I think it's going to be a wait and watch situation in all the countries, whether they're directly or indirectly affected by the situation. But as far as OPEC Plus and production is concerned, I don't see them making any changes anytime soon. There'll have to be a very good reason for them to make a change on their production targets.
Let me get your perspective on Iran and its role as an oil-producing nation. Now, Iran, post the Ukraine-Russia war and Russia and Russian oil being shunned, did get a sort of a fillip to its own oil production and exports. How do you see that now playing out with Russia in the bad books, so to speak, Iran back in the bad books? What does that tell us about global inventory levels and production capacities?
So, Tamanna, great question. That is more the longer term ramifications that I alluded to at the start. So this is again, I think that this is something which is very hard for the oil market to decipher or to assess with any degree of confidence that this is how it's going to go. So there has been quite a bit of speculation. Oh, let me just backtrack very quickly. So yes, indeed, Iranian oil production has risen to 5-year highs. Their exports have risen. Their production is almost at 3.2 million barrels per day now, which is the levels that were last seen before the Trump administration reimposed sanctions on them. But as far as US-Iran relations are concerned, which I just mentioned, had been swarming up a little bit. Yes, they may go south again, but whether as a result the US begins to tighten the implementation of sanctions or not, there have been suggestions that the US might, as a sort of a repercussion for Iran being thought to be behind this Hamas attack on Israel. But I think a lot of things up in the air still, whether the US does it. So you have to keep in mind also that the US would not want to take any steps right now that further escalate this conflict, push Iran into a corner, or make price or reduce the global supplies. As you just mentioned, Russian supplies are already a little bit tentative. So the US wouldn't want to take any such steps. So you have to keep that in mind as well. I think it'll be a wait and watch for the market.
What about the Indian point of view over here? We import from Russia, we import from Iran. We're heavily dependent on imported crude. And of course, prices going up is bad news for us. We don't know how long that will last, but from the Indian point of view, how does the picture look right now?
Yeah, the good news, Tamanna, is that India has a very important voice on the world stage now. Just 2 weeks ago at the ADIPEC conference in Abu Dhabi, we had the Indian oil minister convey very, very clearly to his counterparts in the OPEC plus producing countries that Indian consumers' pain point is around $80 per barrel crude. Now, that was, of course, coming days after Brent had been around 97, which is clearly, quite debilitating for from the perspective of inflation, as well as the drain on the exchequer, as India imports more than 80% of its crude. So, look, I think the voice is being heard in the Middle East. And I think the Middle East is also paying very close attention to the other steps that India is taking to reduce its dependence on oil, right? So to go more into renewables, into biofuels, and so on. So all of this is being very closely watched. I do feel that despite the very hawkish rhetoric that tends to come out from Saudi Arabia or other Middle Eastern oil producers, I think they will keep their ear very close to the ground on, the more price-sensitive economies, which are now their biggest markets and biggest growing markets. They cannot ignore it.
Well, let's hope for the best. Like you said, wait and watch is the mode that we are in right now. Thank you so much, Vandana Hari. Always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks, Tamanna.